Hello and welcome to more history stuff. So this is the second in a series of episodes I'm making about Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn, Lord of Southern Powys in Wales in the 13th century, and in my opinion one of the most interesting and formidable characters of this era of Welsh history. So in the last episode we left Gruffudd living in exile on the manor of Ashford in Derbyshire with his two brothers, Owain and Madog, because their father Gwenwynwyn had been driven out of Powys by his enemy Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, otherwise known as Llywelyn the Great, ruler of Gwynedd. Now Gwenwynwyn dies shortly afterwards. This is in the year 1216, and this leaves his three young boys in the custody of the King of England, Henry III. So to move the story on a bit, in 1218 Llywelyn agrees to a truce with Henry, in which Llywelyn makes a series of promises with regard to Gruffudd and his brothers. He promises that when the boys come of age, when they reach adulthood, he'll give their father's lands back to them. These are the lands in southern Powys that he had conquered from their father, Gwenwynwyn. And if you believe that, you'll believe anything. And he also promises to pay for their upkeep and to pay for the upkeep of their mother, Margaret Corbett. She's a member of the Corbett family of Corse and Gruffudd in the Welsh March, quite an important family on the Anglo-Welsh borderlands. Llywelyn sadly doesn't stick to any of these promises. He breaks the treaty almost as soon as the ink's dry, really. And this leaves Gruffudd and his brothers needing someone else to look after them. So Henry puts them in the care of Ranulph Blondeville, the Earl of Chester. The Earldom of Chester is probably the most powerful of the marcher lordships on the border, and so it makes sense for the king to put these three boys into Ranulph's custody. From Llywelyn's perspective, this turns out to be a mistake on his part. What he should have done probably is take the boys into his care, raise them in a Welsh household instead of an English one, so they would have been raised with Welsh customs and traditions and laws instead of English ones. And he could have made allies of them. He could have turned them into his friends, perhaps married them off to his daughters, and this would have sealed a bloodless alliance between Gwynedd and southern Powys and turned these two lordships into one political union. Instead of which, he chooses to cut them loose. He's not interested in looking after the sons of one of his enemies, probably because he thinks that his position in Powys is so secure. He's conquered the territory and defeated the dynasty of southern Powys, that he doesn't need to make any concessions or compromises. It's unfortunate that he makes this promise that he will do these things, because he then immediately breaks that promise, and this probably only prolongs the sort of the grudge, the feud between the two rival dynasties in Wales. It certainly seems to have influenced Gruffudd and to driven his actions for the rest of his life. He never forgets where he's come from, that he is the son of a man who's been attacked and defeated by the lords of Gwynedd, and these same lords then swore promises to look after him and immediately broke them. So Gruffudd really grows up with no reason whatsoever to have any love for Prince Llywelyn or any of the dynasty of Gwynedd. He will have seen them very much as his enemies. Excuse me while I take a sip of tea. And so Gruffudd reaches adulthood about over a decade later, in 1232, when he becomes Lord of Ashford. He actually takes possession of the manor of Ashford in Derbyshire, and that's quite interesting because Gruffudd isn't the eldest son. His oldest brother, Owain, according to the English laws of inheritance, remember this is in England of course, should have inherited the manor, but instead Gruffudd takes it. And this is perhaps an early indication of his sort of ruthless strength of character, that he's going to take what he thinks is his, and God help anyone who gets in his way. And in the following years, he's very active trying to recover his lands in Powys from Llywelyn the Great, who is now getting on in years, but Llywelyn is still very powerful, very difficult to defeat either in war or politics. Gruffudd takes part in several not very successful English campaigns in Wales. Doesn't really achieve anything very much, but then his fortunes change when Llywelyn dies in 1240, and he's succeeded by his son Dafydd ap Llywelyn, who becomes the new Lord of Gwynedd. And Henry, very soon after Llywelyn's death, takes advantage to invade North Wales and force a peace settlement upon Dafydd. Dafydd is briefly very vulnerable and not really able to defend himself against the English invasion. And Gruffudd is very quick to seize this opportunity as well. He accompanies the king into North Wales, helps him to defeat Dafydd, and then as the price for his support, he wants his lands back because Henry is now in a position of supremacy in Wales. And Gruffudd sees this as his great chance to recover his father's inheritance, which was snatched away from him by Llywelyn. And he does. Henry grants him his land back, but, excuse me, Gruffudd is not allowed to have it cheaply or freely. He has to pay a fine of 300 marks, about £200, quite a lot of money, to the king to have his lands back. But more than that, he's also got to give hostages to Henry for his good behaviour, and swear an oath that he will never leave the king's fealty. So all of this implies that Henry doesn't really trust Gruffudd, that he knows full well that the only reason Gruffudd has supported him against the Lord of Gwynedd in Wales is because Gruffudd is basically serving his own interests. He wants his lands back. And this is perfectly typical behaviour for the time. If you think in terms of nationality of English v Welsh, then you have a bit of a problem, I think, with understanding what's really going on in this era. Gruffudd was very much a Welsh man, a Welsh prince. He was very much aware of his ancestry. The fact that he was raised in England shouldn't really be counted against him in that way. He didn't choose to be raised in England. Him and his family were driven into exile. And it is very clear that his driving motive in life is to restore the fortunes of his dynasty, this very old Welsh royal dynasty, and recover the lands that have been taken from them by another Welsh dynasty. And the fact that Prince Llywelyn and his heirs, the Lords of Gwynedd, are Gruffudd's fellow Welshmen, and that they share a culture and a language and all the rest of it, doesn't really influence the politics of the situation. They are enemies. And as I said earlier, I think that Llywelyn really missed an opportunity in 1218 to turn the Lords of Powys into his friends. Instead, his decision to break the terms of the Treaty of Worcester, it really just prolongs this conflict that's already been going on for generations. And after that point, there can be no reconciliation or permanent reconciliation, really. Gruffudd, in particular, is bent upon not only recovering his lands in Wales, but bringing about the destruction of the House of Gwynedd, the line of Aberfraw. He is determined, before he dies, to get his final revenge on them. So, we're in 1241, and Gruffudd is doing pretty well. He's managed to recover his lands, but this is as a result of the temporary weakness of Prince Dafydd in Gwynedd. And Dafydd quite quickly recovers his position, and more wars and conflicts erupt in North Wales. But by 1247, only 6 years later, Gruffudd has actually been driven out again. He's managed to regain his inheritance for about 5 or 6 years, but then he loses it again as the armies of Gwynedd recover and launch another invasion. And he's, poor old Gruffudd, he's driven back into England, and he finds himself back on his old manor of Ashford. counting the cost, thinking, oh, what have I got to do to get my lands back permanently? So he's been disinherited again, and this remains the case for several years. But he's not. We shouldn't get the impression that he's somehow landless or short of money or anything like that. He's very good at building up his power on the march by organising all these marriage and dynastic alliances with other march lords, and he plays that particular game very well. And he's quite ruthless about it. And if I can find them in my terribly organised notes, I'll give some examples. So, for instance, in the 1250s, Gruffudd invades the manor of Borsley, which is one of the many manors, lands, estates on the Welsh March, which is held by a lord called Fulk Fitzwarren. And he only agrees to restore Fitzwarren's land if he agrees to marry Gruffudd's daughter, which he does. So this is how Gruffudd builds up his power on the march. He's quite aggressive. He plays this game of politics, or this Game of Thrones, if you will, very well, and he's entirely ruthless. He is quite prepared to invade other people's lands and strong-arm them into marrying his daughter, for instance. So he will then have a powerful lord like Fulk Fitzwarren for a son-in-law, but he'll also have a claim over his lands. And this is how he sort of slowly expands his power on the borderlands. At the same time, he enters into quite a vicious feud with the Corbetts, who I mentioned earlier, who are actually his mother's family, so they're his relatives. And he fights this border war against Thomas Corbett, who is a very similar character to Gruffudd, very ambitious, aggressive, very smart, entirely ruthless. These men are totally unprincipled. And they carry on fighting for about 15 or 16 years, killing each other's men, burning their corn, driving out their peasants, all this sort of tit-for-tat, vicious private war. And this just goes on for years. It seems to be the sort of thing they rather enjoy doing. These are sort of aggressive, if this was the Wild West, they'd be like cattle barons, forever fighting and raiding each other. So this is Gruffudd's life, really. He's constantly fighting and intriguing on the march, and at the same time he's constantly trying to think of ways of which he can get his land back in Powys and destroy his arch enemies, the princes of Gwynedd. That's his main aim in life, I think, is to destroy Gwynedd. He fights lots of other people, but these are sort of like these are sort of private feuds that can be settled one way or another, but he's absolutely hell-bent on destroying the line of Llywelyn the Great. Which makes it all the more surprising that in the year 1257 he actually becomes an ally of Gwynedd, which you would not expect looking at the past details of his career. This is a very strange move. He actually forges an alliance with Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, who is the successor to Dafydd ap Llywelyn. Llywelyn is, at this point in his career, extremely successful, very impressive, talented politician and soldier. And Gruffudd, for reasons that I shall describe in the next video, decides to throw in his lot with him. So, if you're enjoying this, please stay tuned and I'll hopefully speak to you again later.